So welcome everyone to this evening's program, Jacob Steere-Williams, Typhoid Fever and the Origins of Epidemiology in Victorian Britain. We are delighted to have you with us virtually here at the New York Academy of Medicine Library. I am Arlene Sheener, the Historical Collections Librarian. And here at the New York Academy of Medicine, we are champions for health equity. Our vision is a world where everyone has the opportunity to live a healthy life. Our drive for health equity has never been more vital. Because health equity is deeply tied to systemic racism, we actively tackle the issues that are important for social justice in order to advance our mission and promote our vision. Through scholarly engagement, community engagement, and public engagement, we work together to build a more equitable and healthier world for all. I am delighted to welcome you this evening to this event, which is presented by the New York Academy of Medicine's library and sponsored by the Pine Tree Foundation. The Academy's library is one of the most significant historical medical libraries in the country, if not in the world. And it is and has been our mission to safeguard the heritage of medicine to inform the future of health. We run programs based in history, the humanities, and the arts. We inform, educate, and motivate the public to action on current issues of medicine and public health. And in these times of the COVID pandemic, the insights of history are even more important. Our program this fall addresses this, including this evening's talk. Before turning to the event, I wanted to remind everyone that next week we are continuing our exploration of race and health in historical context and the ongoing challenges that have been laid bare by the COVID pandemic. On the afternoon of October 1st, we are hosting Black Maternal Health, Historical and Reproductive Justice Reckonings, featuring historian Georgia Cooper Owens and activist and scholar Lynn Roberts, in a program that is co-sponsored by us with the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine in Philadelphia. You can register on our website, and we're also going to drop the link to the registration page into the chat for you so that you should be able to see it. Just give me 1 second here. I just want to make sure that we've got a little bit of housekeeping about the way today's program or this evening's program is going to proceed. So Jacob is going to give his talk, and while he is speaking, we invite you to put your questions into the chat. And then at the end of the talk, I will be sharing the questions with him during the question and answer period. You will also still be able to put questions into the chat after the talk is over, but please do add them as they come to mind. So it's now absolutely my pleasure to introduce Jacob Steere-Williams for his talk on typhoid fever and the origins of epidemiology in Victorian Britain. Dr. Steere-Williams is an associate professor of history and the director of the graduate history program at the College of Charleston. He received his PhD from the University of Minnesota and joined the faculty in the college in 2011. He is a historian of epidemic disease, primarily in 19th and early 20th century Britain and the former British colonies, but he's also very active in public history projects, including at the Waring Historical Library at the Medical University of South Carolina, where they have an oral history project documenting life during the COVID-19 pandemic, and also at the NYU COVID-19 History Working Group. His new book, which is coming out this fall, is The Filth Disease, Typhoid Fever and the Practices of Epidemiology in Victorian England, which is published by the University of Rochester Press in the Studies in Medical History series. The Filth Disease is the first book to examine one of the most feared and important epidemic diseases of the 19th century, typhoid fever. It explores the everyday practices of epidemiologists in Britain and across the British colonies and shows how on-the-ground investigators of faulty sewers, leaky house drains, contaminated milk, and polluted waterways forged broader ideas of how to study epidemics and how to make public health change. So I'm going to turn the program over to him, and we will drop a link to the website for the book into the chat as well, so that you can have an opportunity to find that if you would like to do so.
Thank you so much, Arlene. I really appreciate that kind introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen here and start my presentation. Is that coming up all right? I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. To start out with, I realize the way in which there is both an earnest kind of interest and want to hear more about contextualizing and understanding COVID-19 using the history of public health and past pandemics, but I also understand both very personally and emotionally, and I think a lot of you probably feel the same way, the way in which that is a difficult kind of reckoning process as well. So I appreciate you being here. In the winter of 1871, all of Britain was gripped with the front page headline that Queen Victoria's eldest son and heir to the throne, Prince Albert Edward, later King Edward VII, was dangerously sick with typhoid fever. Never before that we can remember, noted an editorial in The Lancet, has the bearing of all classes exhibited the strength of that common band of sorrowful sympathy which we are all bound together as a nation. Believed to have caught typhoid fever, the dreaded Filth Disease, while on a hunting trip at Scarborough, Bertie, as he was affectionately known, first showed signs of typhoid on 13 December 1871. He was quickly taken to the family estate, his deceased father's favorite, at Sandringham House, where his condition quickly worsened. The anxiety of the household, high and low, is intense. Those in the inner circle feel very anxious, the Duke of Cambridge noted in his diary for November 23rd. But the anxiety, I want to make clear to you, was a public one as well. Popular newspapers printed daily updates on the prince's condition, posting handbills throughout cities throughout Britain. It was probably the most intense subject of the day, one that engages all pens, tongues, and hearts, the Illustrated London News noted. And there was good reason. High fever, languor, chills, delirium, wheezing, sputum, vomiting, diarrhea, severe headaches marked the prince's condition. He would wake up in the evenings in a feverish, delirious fits. One night in December, it's probably one of my most interesting, sort of sadly comical insights from the archives. One night in December, the prince woke up claiming he was in an American hotel. Another night, he mistook his own identity and quarreled with his physicians that someone else was the one coughing in the room, not him. And so deteriorating was the royal sickness that Bertie's wife, Princess Alexandra, met with the local clergy in Sandringham in early December to prepare a funeral. And the seemingly crisis came on December 8th of the prince's bout with typhoid. His temperature in the evening had spiked to 100 degrees for most of the night. He was hallucinating and uncontrollably vomiting. Queen Victoria was telegraphed in the morning by the two royal physicians who were attending the case you see here, Sir William Gull and Sir William Jenner, to come at once. Victoria was set to arrive at 4 p.m. that day. And around 2 p.m., when Gull and Jenner took a break from tending to the prince, Jenner whispered to Gull, "If he lives till 4 when the queen arrives, I shall be satisfied." And all signs that day in December looked as if the prince would die. But armed with a conservative treatment of brandy and arrowroot, I have, the William Gull's case notes from the Wellcome Library showing his hourly prescriptions to the prince. And with no small bit of good fortune, I think, Gull and Jenner probably somewhat shockingly saw the prince through his bout with typhoid, so that by Christmas of 1871, his condition had improved. And I want to pause really to just think about the archival sources that I've used here to put together this really incredible story of Britain's most famous family in the 19th century, a story that until now has not been told. And the way I uncovered it was through finding Gull's case notes, his daily case notes for about 3 months of tending to the Prince of Wales that are kept at the Wellcome. So engrossing was the news of the prince's bout with typhoid that it only matched the fervor, I think, to give you a kind of contemporary understanding in the popular media for news about the Crimean War or the Indian Mutiny Rebellion of the 1850s. It was as if the door of the sick room had been left ajar, the Illustrated London News reported. In other words, the popular coverage turned a private sickbed into a public event, one that was commodified and ingested by the English public. And the rhetoric of one nation grieving at the prince's side took on even greater significance in early 1872, once the prince began to recover. While Bertie was still convalescing, Queen Victoria, who had herself been in about a decades-long period of mourning after her husband and Bertie's father had died of this very same disease, typhoid fever, Victoria ordered for a royal thanksgiving to be held in London on February 6th. It was probably one of the most grandiose spectacles of the entire Victorian era, probably only matched by the Golden and Diamond Jubilees later in the 1880s and the 1890s. Crowds jeered and jostled in London on that day in February. The royal carriage group, highlighted by Queen Victoria and the Prince in one carriage, paraded from Buckingham Palace to St. Paul's Cathedral for a service to mark the Prince's recovery. We have an amazing amount of popular cultural sources that I've relied on to reconstruct that day, which I explore in chapter 1 of my book. In the whole ordeal of the sickness within the royal family and the recovery of the future King of England was in some ways, I argue in my book, The Filth Disease, a turning point in Victorian public health. And I want to start with this anecdote to really think about and frame the ways that epidemics, they leave indelible marks on our communities. 9 months into the COVID-19 pandemic is leaving many of us with the question of when and how will COVID-19 end? And I think we're at an interesting kind of point, maybe even a kind of crossroads. COVID-19 is still here. In some places like where I live in Charleston, South Carolina, the daily cases and the case positive rates are as nearly high as they have been at the worst periods of the pandemic, in our case in Charleston in June. And yet, many people are adjusting to what they believe to be normal. Schools have largely reopened in my area. College football is still once again packing fans into stadiums. And there's a kind of urge, however falsely driven, to return to what many believe to be a pre-COVID normalcy. And as a historian, I keep reflecting on this and the way in which the history of past pandemics tells us there won't be a return to normal, or at least a pre-COVID normal, even if we forge ahead with what will inevitably become a new normal. And this type of thinking about returning to normalcy is, I think, apart from pandemic fatigue, caused by a kind of way in which we understand the fabric of broader ways to frame pandemics. And one that I'm afraid, from the world that I'm seeing around me in my community, one that inherently misguides our thinking. And here we might step back, and this is something that I've been mulling over a lot, to think about the popular ways that everyday people frame the geography and the temporality of epidemics. And I think there's this sort of belief out there that epidemics erupt out of thin air, that they harm, and then they go away. And when we model COVID-19, for example, on something like what we've seen in the media a lot, the 1918-1919 Spanish flu, this perception is strengthened in some ways, and maybe that's to our detriment. I keep hearing people say, for example, in my local community, I'm over COVID-19. And that's interesting to me because of the reality that the pandemic and the causative organism is not yet done with us. And apart from that temporal framing, that epidemics begin and then they end, is a kind of geographical idea or calculated idea, probably inherited, I think, from the xenophobic legacies in the West of past pandemics, that COVID-19, like other past pandemics, that they spread like mist from the East to the West in a kind of linear marching fashion, which any epidemiologist or intro student to epidemiology will tell you that such a view of COVID-19 or many other infectious diseases is a fallacy, one that leads people to put their guard down. The experts today are pointing to two possible solutions with COVID-19. Either we develop a biomedical solution through a preventive vaccine, or, as you know, barring a vaccine, we live with the disease and hope that the novel coronavirus evolves alongside our growing host antibody resistance, something to what many evolutionary biologists think about as a decreased level of virulence of the organism. And it's at this crossroads of sorts where we stand today, asking questions about the future, where we might look to the past and look to the history of public health. And I think the history of public health right now has an enormous cultural value in helping us to understand not just our moment, but where we might be headed. And there's a wealth of research, those of you who are either historians of public health or librarians or archivists or just consumers of this knowledge, about, for example, the development of vaccines in the recent past, of botched vaccine trials for polio and unethical protocols for early stem cell research. Likewise, there's the story of the global eradication of smallpox in this 20th century, the glaring example of how a truly global disease surveillance system might work for COVID-19. And yet here we are, steeped in the reality dealing with COVID 8 months in, of how political epidemics and pandemics are. In this country, in America, our top leaders and even our current president have disavowed global solutions, the WHO, in a global response to the pandemic. So without a biomedical intervention, which may take a year, it may take 5 years, it may never come, we're facing the reality of living with COVID-19. And in terms familiar to epidemiologists, COVID-19 would transition from a pandemic to an endemic. Over time, it would be a disease within our population. And what's so interesting to me as a historian of epidemiology and of epidemics is the particular nature and the profile of COVID-19, especially its communicative routes in the community as a cluster outbreak, which might be our reality of dealing with for some time. And here too, I think the history of public health of past pandemics can help us. But it's not in the ways that I think public discourse has tended to discuss history in the past several months. As many of you know, there have been a great deal of historical references in popular media of past pandemics, of mask-wearing debates in late 19th century China, or in the early 20th century in the West during the Spanish flu, of Western xenophobia rearing its head yet again from the mid-19th century dealing with cholera outbreaks. And I want to be clear that I'm really proud of my colleagues in the history of medicine and public health for engaging in this kind of scholarship. But I've also been thinking a lot more about what it means to use history and think through history in this moment. Pandemics, of course, they defy discipline and they defy historical precedent. No two pandemics are alike, even if our human response has discernible, repeatable, even durable kinds of patterns of naming and blaming. So what I've found most salient about connecting the history of public health to our current moment and navigating our current moment are two features of COVID-19. The pandemic's epidemiological nature as a cluster disease, and what I'm seeing right now and have been seeing for months is a kind of broader cultural mistrust in epidemiological knowledge. And in the rest of my talk this evening, I'll focus on those two elements. The history of modern epidemiology as both a routinized state-sponsored activity and as an academic discipline has its roots in the mid-19th century. Often historians and practitioners alike have framed the origins of epidemiology around a couple of well-trodden stories. John Snow's heroics in tracing an outbreak of cholera to the Broad Street Pump in 1850 Soho, where he used shoe leather practices and a spot map that many of you surely have seen. And William Farr, his innovative genius in using differential statistics to understand the community patterns of the spread of cholera in the same period. These stories are deep-seated. Introductory public health textbooks even today and undergraduate classes in public health routinely explain the beginning of modern epidemiology in this way. For example, the 2019 edition of the CDC Field Epidemiology Manual invokes two Victorians as modern epidemiologists, John Snow and William Farr. Interestingly, framing the origins of modern epidemiology in this way actually began in the interwar period in the 20th century, and largely in American public health departments, who sought rhetorical strategies for differentiating academic and applied epidemiology apart from biometrics and bacteriology. But such an approach belies what was actually the richest period in the history of modern epidemiology, the period from 1860 to 1900, when epidemiological practice and disease surveillance in Britain became a central arm of government. And this is largely this kind of broad overview of what my book that's coming out in mid-November, The Filth Disease, is about. Now, the model for the rise of epidemiology in the second half of the 19th century was not, as many scholars and practitioners alike have said, cholera and the work of William Farr and John Snow, but in reality, I think it was on epidemiological research on typhoid fever, a cluster disease, really the prototypical cluster disease in the second half of the 19th century in Britain. Typhoid's long and twisting history in the West has largely been unexplored. Although evolutionary biologists tell us that it's a disease long tied to human settlement, typhoid was a disease without even a name until the 1830s, when French pathological anatomists differentiated two types of what was then called typhus via the inflamed tissue of the Peyer's patches of the small intestine. Typhoid, according to famed French doctor Pierre Louis, literally meant typhus-like. But diagnosing the disease and debating its epidemiological transmission was so hotly contested from 1830 to 1870 that it wasn't even until 1869 that the General Registrar's Office, the central compiler of births and deaths in England and Wales, listed typhoid separately as a cause of death. That's interesting because throughout the period, typhoid was a serious and persistent health threat, annually sickening 100 to 150,000 Britons and killing up to 20,000 per year. Typhoid was, and here's where the connection I think is quite salient, it was a cluster disease in the 19th century. It was a fulminating disease, meaning that it would episodically explode, seemingly in random areas each year, and seemingly without a pattern. Its movement, its spread in the community wasn't linear. So confusing was the disease incidence and patterns in community spread that doctors and many of the broader public alike believed, even after Louis Pasteur had denunciated spontaneous generation, that typhoid could simply pop up without prior ancestral cases from environmental causes related to filth. That classic categorization that was both physical description and moralizing sentiment. Typhoid would come from stagnant cesspools, overflowed privies, and stinking dung heaps. Rates of typhoid were a test, according to Britain's leading health officer, John Simone, of the era, of a location's sanitary civilization. Now, behind such an etiological framing was a deep-seated moralism, inherited from an earlier era dominated by the familiar names of Edwin Chadwick and Thomas Southwood Smith in the history of British public health. One which said that the chief cause of sickness was filth, and the chief propagators of filth were the poor. And we can look no further from the literature of this period than the infamous urban industrial fever dens and fever nests. And I walk you through this background to demonstrate just how important it was, how much it captivated the broader public attention when in late 1871, the heir to the British throne contracted and nearly died from typhoid fever, a disease that in the public moral imagination was a disease of the poor, a disease of the filthiest of the filth. The royal attack turned that filth logic on its head. If the prince could get sick, so could anyone. And moreover, if he could recover, which he did in early 1872, perhaps the entire nation could solve the typhoid problem. The 1870s were a galvanizing decade in British public health, which saw the landmark Public Health Acts of 1872 and 1875. Together, these acts compelled local authorities to provide municipal sanitation systems and to hire a local medical officer of health. The acts also allowed for a national disease surveillance system, centralized at the medical department of the local government board, whose small team of inspectors were charged with keeping track of infectious disease outbreaks and investigating those outbreaks when local communities were struck. It was the first nucleus of a modern public health department in Britain, and it was the first to systematize the practices of state-sponsored epidemiology that would come to influence other areas in Europe and in North America. And in the period from 1860 to 1900, for example, there was no disease that was more closely studied than typhoid fever in this period. Each year, as typhoid outbreaks would erupt, seemingly without pattern in local communities, an inspector would be sent from London to investigate. And there were hundreds of these types of outbreak investigations of typhoid in this period, which I explore in my book. Each of these outbreaks presented an opportunity, another illuminating angle on how contaminated surface wells, leaking privy pipes, breakdowns in public water systems, contaminated milk supplies, all contributed to widespread community infection. The growing consensus amongst that small cadre of would-be or proto-epidemiologists who began to be thinking themselves in really sociological and disciplinary ways as epidemiologists was that the sheer accumulation of filth alone didn't cause typhoid, but rather specific structural problems in sewerage, in water supply, and in food pathways did. So by 1880, I argue in my book, on the verge of the discovery of the causative organism of typhoid fever, first called B. typhosus and later known in the 20th century and still known today as Salmonella typhi, the major epidemiological roots of the disease, really its epidemiological pathways, save for the healthy carrier, had already been discovered. That was through local outbreak investigation. In the process of investigating local outbreaks of typhoid throughout Britain, the field of epidemiology thrived as the chief science of preventive medicine. Outbreak investigation, one contemporary noted, was a dangerous public duty, and epidemiologists exposed themselves at every visit to an infected district to the attacks of an unseen enemy, whom they track into his hiding places and seek to expel from his strongholds. Particularly important during this period was the way in which the everyday practices and methods of epidemiology coalesced and became routinized. Case tracing, hunting for index cases, interviewing, analyzing differential statistics, experimenting, and thinking visually through maps, diagrams, charts, and photographs all became part of what I call in my book everyday epidemiology. Addressing the Epidemiological Society of London in 1868, for example, one of Britain's leading and early epidemiologists, John Netten Radcliffe, laid out a 6-point practical plan for outbreak investigation, looking for index cases, recording patterns of individuals, and tracing them throughout the community. It looks strikingly like a modern version of public health practice already by 1868. Now, let me provide a couple of examples from my book that put these points into sharper focus. In 1868, for example, Richard Thornthorne, another inspector, was sent to the small market town of Winterton in Lincolnshire to investigate an explosive local outbreak. Interviewing local residents and doctors, Thorne turned to a granular case study of the first recognized cases in the area at 4 cottages whose typhoid-laced sewage contents had contaminated the local surface well. Notice here that it wasn't a Jon Snow-like spot map which unearthed the cause of the local outbreak for Thorne, but rather a diagram, an overlooked feature of epidemiological practice in this period. While outbreak investigation was sometimes granular, like Thorne's study of Winterton, often epidemiologists in this period turned to population-level studies as well. A year later, in 1869, to provide another example, Netten Radcliffe was sent to Stamford, another market town. With mortality data gleaned from the General Registrar's office, Radcliffe also obtained from the district medical officer morbidity data, sickness data. He constructed a spot map, but one actually much more sophisticated than an earlier version that you see from the 1850s with a practitioner like Snow, adding the position of key structural items, such as cesspools, wells, and the nature of the soil. It is no exaggeration, Radcliffe noted in a private memo, to say that the inhabitants drink water which is polluted with their own stools. Lovely stuff. Now, rule isolated outbreaks of typhoid in places like Winterton and Stamford provided unique epidemiological case studies for how typhoid spread in the community. They weren't blockbuster events like the sickness of the future King of England. They were rural, they were isolated, but they were opportunities for epidemiologists to, in a confined community, closely study how the disease was spread. But there was one striking feature that frustrated epidemiologists in this period, and that was the complex nature of some outbreaks. In 1873, for instance, typhoid erupted in the West End of London, amongst some of the city's most wealthy inhabitants. What the cases had in common, Radcliffe discovered, is that households where typhoid struck derived their milk from a common supply. Radcliffe traced the origin of the milk supply to a rural dairy farm in Oxfordshire and discovered there both the index case, the owner of the farm had died of typhoid fever, matching up with the incubation period and the delivery of the milk to London. And he discovered through looking at and tracing the sanitary system of the dairy farm, the fecal contamination of the well water used for dairy purposes. You can see here again how diagrams worked as visual strategies in constructing epidemiological knowledge. Traversing urban and rural food pathways, it was recognized by the mid-1870s, would be crucial to curbing typhoid outbreaks. But just who would do that kind of surveillance still remained a question. By the 1890s, to provide one final example, British epidemiologists started to see even bigger structural and environmental connections as to how typhoid spread. An especially important investigation was conducted by Frederick Berry after back-to-back explosions of typhoid in the Tees Valley. Berry's year-long study involved an entire region of northern England and a contaminated river system. He used increasingly complicated differential statistics, intricate maps, and even photographs. But lest you think this story in my book is one of rosy progressive development of modern public health, the reality, I want to be clear, was that although the pathways of typhoid spread were becoming clear by the end of the 19th century, epidemiologists faced enormous challenges. Armed with the knowledge of what the environmental and structural problems were, the solutions remained unclear for decades. Developing and sometimes overhauling municipal sanitation systems, establishing surveillance protocols for food pathways, and rethinking the location, the design, and the functioning of domestic sanitation were all cumbersome tasks. And rarely did even the engineers who were experts on these topics agree on the specific implementation of these technologies. In other words, even armed with the etiological knowledge of the spread of the disease, the politics of public health often presented a barrier to solving real-world problems. So too did convincing everyday people to change their personal habits around food, water, soil, and matters of plumbing. Now, the Victorian public health officers I study in my book, the earliest self-professed epidemiologists, they shared a kind of optimism that environmental problems could be solved through sound science and rational governance. Typhoid presented a formal challenge to that model, to that belief, and it proved that such optimism was often misguided and needed rethinking. What became clear to epidemiologists in the second half of the 19th century was that in order for widespread change in preventive public health to occur, epidemiological knowledge had to be communicated to various publics, to local officials, to business owners, to lawmakers, and to everyday people. This took rhetorical strategies of convincing, what today we might call health promotion or health communication, and what John Simone in the 1870s called moral pressure. A major theme in my book, and something that I think is often overlooked in the history of public health, is how public health knowledge about epidemics, of how epidemiological knowledge is produced, is defended, and is debated. And in each of the case studies in my book, I go through how that process worked at a very granular level. Sometimes epidemiologists succeeded in communicating to local or to national officials why an outbreak had occurred and how it could be prevented. But there were frustrations as well, as you might imagine. And epidemiologists at the time were called meddlesome and troublesome inspectors who had no right to tell local folks what to do about home and hearth. And I'm reminded here of what I think is a quite enormous backlash against leading public health officials today in America during our own pandemic, particularly Anthony Fauci. In the first decades of the 20th century, typhoid rates took a sharp decline, in large part because the typhoid problem became seen as a systemic problem, one of the built and the natural environment, of urban and rural connections, and of technical know-how and of changing personal habits. It became really a global kind of solution. Apart from a few scattered outbreaks in the 1920s and the 1930s, typhoid largely disappeared in the West. George Whipple's 1908 typhoid diagram nicely summarizes a generation's worth of epidemiological sleuthing to uncover how the disease was spread. But even then, with epidemiological and increasingly bacteriological clarity, race, gender, ethnicity, and class still were important monikers for understanding and framing typhoid fever. And in fact, there's an interesting way in which, as typhoid declined in the early 20th century, pop-up sporadic cluster outbreaks became even more so vehicles for the categories of race, gender, ethnicity, and class to rear their heads in framing typhoid. The well-known case of Typhoid Mary Mallon, framed as the most dangerous woman in America, as you probably will know, belies the reframing of typhoid in the early 20th century as a disease of filth, a disease of those other than bourgeois, middle class, respectable citizens. Popular iconography from the early 20th century shows how these ideas lived on, even as the disease declined, and even as epidemiological clarity was as strong as ever. Two Virginia health bulletins from the 1920s, for example, show typhoid's correct epidemiology through flies, through carelessness, through bad milk, through bad water, but mapped on to the habits of African Americans and Orientalized dragons. In the 21st century, typhoid is a long forgotten memory in the West. The only salient stories most historians even teach about the disease is that of Typhoid Mary. And I suspect many of you listening here this evening, if you have heard of typhoid, it's through the story of Typhoid Mary. Today, typhoid remains a systemic global health problem, predominantly in the global South, where it strikes 20 million people each year and kills about 200,000 annually. A 2019 study in The Lancet that I recently read called typhoid an invisible global burden, and that to solve the problem, we need global solutions, better data, better surveillance. And that it sounds remarkably similar to what happened in the 19th century in Britain, what I talk about and explore in my book, The Filth Disease. Although the West took a systemic approach to curbing typhoid, we've yet to take a global approach to understanding and curbing typhoid. That's interesting considering the legacies of both modern epidemiology and Western imperialism. The origins of what I call everyday epidemiology, using the methods of case tracing, interviewing, statistics, map making, all remain central parts of global public health. The CDC's recent Principles of Epidemiology and Public Health Practice describe the steps of an outbreak investigation, for example, that are remarkably similar to what I've described for the late 19th century. Disease surveillance, of course, more broadly, remains central to the enterprise of modern governance. And yet, typhoid fever, amongst a host of other diseases, prevail. Typhoid's history might give us some pause right now as we continue to struggle with COVID-19. Dealing with cluster outbreaks takes rethinking the spread of an epidemic, really rethinking what does an epidemic really mean. Epidemiologists today might well be asking, similar to their late 19th century counterparts, what kind of rhetorical, communicative strategies are they employing to discuss the cause and prevention of COVID-19? How does epidemiological knowledge today get communicated? Who needs to be convinced of the science of disease communication? And what are those rhetorical strategies? These, of course, are inherently political questions. They were to the Victorians who studied and grappled with typhoid, and they are today. And I worry, as one final thought, as a historian of public health and somebody who's been studying typhoid for a couple decades now, in thinking about our future with COVID-19, about disappearance narratives and cultural amnesia, of diseases we think we conquered and yet remain serious global problems. Two of the nations that did so well in curbing typhoid, Britain and America, are faring just about the worst with COVID-19. But vaccine or no vaccine, we might imagine a future where COVID-19 becomes, like many other infectious diseases have become in the last 200 years, a disease of the global South, one triumphed by the West. And we should be super cautious of such framing. In connecting the past with the present, we can find a salutary reminder of the cultural milieu in which infectious diseases strike populations and how scientists study them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. So I will start the questions, and please, people in the audience, please do put your questions into the chat so that we can have a conversation. So I was struck in your talk tonight by the parallels that you see, especially in New York in the 19th century, with understandings of disease, with understandings of causation. So of course, here in New York, one of the stories that we tell a lot about public health is the Citizens Association of New York and their mapping of the city of New York in an attempt to get legislation passed that gave us a health department. And they, of course, go door to door to door to door. They map everything. So all of the kinds of things that you're talking about, privies and unclean milk and slaughterhouses and all and you know, the lack of sanitation. They put together this incredible document where they argue that so much of the disease that people suffer from in New York is preventable, that they use Europe as a model back in 1865 for much more successful public health practice. And they kind of give you the mortality statistics from a variety of different locations in Western Europe, saying, look how much lower the incidence of mortality is. We need to do better. And it is that report, that gigantic report, that eventually gets the health legislation passed and kind of starts to move them forward. But of course, New York continues for decades still to be very challenging as a location. Even in the early 20th century, when Stephen Smith publishes The City That Was, he's still saying, look in Europe, they're doing so much better than we're doing. We need to do these things. So I'm interested in your views of kind of understandings. It's clear to me, as I think it is to many other people, that on some level, this is not about, by that point, it's not a question of understanding. It's a question of implementation.
That's exactly right. You know, and I think, and like I said, and I found this to be actually a little bit of a startling revelation when I got into the research for this book. A lot of our histories of public health talk about bacteriology emerging in the 1880s and the 1890s and providing a kind of aha moment for public health, to say, well, now we have quote unquote real laboratory evidence of the causative organisms for many infectious diseases. And in reality, when I started following these Victorian epidemiologists, they had already discovered most of the major pathways for not just typhoid, but many other infectious diseases by the time that the causative organism was discovered. And most of them, in their diaries and their journals and their reports, they even mention, they say, well, this German doctor discovered the causative organism of, and they often talk about it in such flippant ways too. Some German doctor discovered, the causative organism of cholera or typhoid, but big whoop, because we are the ones that know how the disease moves in the population. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is, by about the 1880s and the 1890s, at least in Britain, I think, there's a lot of parallels, of course, for North America, is that on the ground knowledge of how epidemics move in communities can be one that is enacted upon in a kind of political lawmaking interventionist way. Whereas just having the confirmatory evidence that someone is a positive with typhoid fever can lead to different kinds of public health interventions, one that we famously see with the case of Mary Mallon, but they're often back-end kinds of solutions. And in this way, bacteriology gets framed in the first few decades of its real use in public health as a kind of back-end science. And so I think you're absolutely spot on that, if we even think about, 1900 as a kind of arbitrary turning point, I think a lot of the, knowledge of the spread of many infectious diseases had been worked out, but the practical solutions were not. And I think in the case of many infectious diseases, particularly food and waterborne diseases, the realization was that these are going to take wholesale changes for reimagining our communities, but changes to our everyday personal habits as well.
Right. I mean, I think you're very right about that. And they also take an enormous amount of investment. So public works investment and convincing, we see this kind of infrastructure argument all the time still. And we often, I think, we try to just kind of cover it over and pretend that it doesn't exist in a lot of places. I mean, you certainly see that here in the United States, although we don't talk about it very much. That there are still many locations where there, we would really need serious changes in investment in infrastructure to create a healthy environment for people to live in. And that is, of course, the same kind of narrative that is spread across the global South, and how to create pathways towards the improvement of that infrastructure in a way that is affordable, in a way that people can understand and will be willing to adopt.
Yeah, there's a question here that just came in that I'll read for everyone about resistance that emerged, either behavioral change or science pushback in the 19th century. And that's a really good question. And that's, thank you, Shelley, for that. That's, that's one of the themes that emerged in my book, even before COVID-19, while I was writing it, is that, these epidemiologists based out of London would travel to, these remote, sometimes remote rural villages to investigate an outbreak. And oftentimes, as you might imagine, they weren't the heroes riding in on a white stallion. They were actually chastised for being meddlesome government, pesky London inspectors. And even when the science was clear, there often, probably more often than not, was pushback. And how that process worked at a very local level. And I was really interested in writing this book and thinking about not just what the broader kind of big discourse was at, big public health or British Medical Association meetings, but what was the everyday practices on the ground? And what that often looked like was these epidemiologists going to local town council meetings and meeting with local officials, meeting with the local engineer, meeting with everyday local people and talking to them. And that, to me, both they experienced that pushback, but oftentimes what I see is in the course of the 19th century, a good deal of success too, in convincing everyday people about the value of epidemiology, the value of knowledge about the spread of pandemics. But surely in the entire period that I studied for this book, that resistance is absolutely front and center. And it's no surprise to me today, following with another question here about current anti-mask movements, to see the kind of pushback against epidemiological knowledge. I mean, I think in some ways that's kind of been imprinted on the fabric of modern society. The rise of epidemiology and the epidemiological expert has also been marked by the critique of epidemiological expertise.
So you've got another question here about how the Victorians tried to communicate and differences between the Victorians and today.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for that question. Yeah, the way that, what's interesting about a lot of the reports that I studied and followed for this book is they often started as government internal documents. Oftentimes they started as confidential memos. So a London inspector would be sent to Winterton or to a rural community and would go and investigate and spend a few months there and would write up this report and then would send it in back in London, and it would go through official channels and be published in annual reports. And in some ways, historians who have acknowledged that these epidemiological investigations existed have sort of argued that they were unimportant because they just lived this life as unused and unread government documents. And anyone who's studied 19th century or knows about 19th century government reports knows that they were published in these big blue books that were giant and, really detailed in 19th century characteristically British ways. But what I found in my book is that if you follow the everyday practices of these outbreak investigations, they were talked about in the local presses of these communities. You see through finding archival sources, which I found throughout Britain in local communities and in the medical department files, that these epidemiologists were producing a whole bunch of other kinds of reports, sometimes orally, sometimes written down, about their experiences conducting outbreak investigation. And so I think these reports actually lived a different kind of life. They were talked about in professional societies and journals, in popular newspapers. But really there's a kind of narrative way, I think, that knowledge about outbreaks was communicated to everyday people in real life in person. And that's a struggle to sort of find and read against the archival documents, but it's one that I found to be really fruitful than just staring at and thinking of these as unused government reports, which I think they were anything but.
So you've got another question here. How did the downtrodden and minorities react to being picked out as those responsible for the disease?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I'm really sensitive. I was really sensitive in writing this book to think through that question as I was thinking through, my archive, because a lot of what I study in trying to think about the rise of modern epidemiology is trying to think through the minds of the 19th century epidemiologists. And thinking through that discourse in the 19th century in Britain is thinking through an overwhelmingly male perspective and an overwhelmingly privileged perspective. And so every time I would read about, a London inspector who was, these guys had very good, education in medicine and public health at the time. And every time I would read about them going to a small town or a rural village, I would read against the grain in those documents to try to find the voices of the everyday people. And surprisingly, they're there. These epidemiological reports are not boring. In case after case that I recount in my book of these local stories, the reports are rich and detailed in narrative. They explain how these epidemiologists talk to everyday people, sometimes using even quotes from everyday people. And what you see is that backlash against this moralism of filth. So in a way, I'll give you an example. In one of the studies that I mentioned of Frederick Barry in the 1890s, who discovers that the entire river system of the Tees Valley has been contaminated along the way, further upstream at a very small village called Barnard Castle, which was, because of some faulty sewage systems there, was receiving the sewage contents and dumping them directly into the river, even though by that time that was an illegal practice. And Barry comes in and he brilliantly uncovers this story. And it's literally detective work in public health at its finest. And yet, when he tries to convince the local people that what they're doing is wrong, he gets it wrong himself. He moralizes them. These are rural villagers who he talks about as being backwards, and he describes as filthy. And in my book, I sort of go through how epidemiology in this period it needs to be communicated. And Barry's a kind of individual who can communicate that to other practitioners, but he can't effectively communicate that to everyday people. And so the local residents of Barnard Castle, they write letters to members of parliament. They write these, op-eds in newspapers, and they decry Barry and the government for coming in and telling them what to do and how to do it. And so there was that pushback. And I think it requires, it does require, not uncommon to, studying issues of race or class and other historical periods and situations. It requires reading against the grain. But doing that process, I think, for me at least, produced something that was much more valuable than a kind of, all-male epidemiologist success story in public health.
Right. So you've got another question here. Do you go into the meddlesome government official pushback in the book? Now, you've just kind of addressed that just a little bit. That resistance is very interesting to the questioner.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Megan, for that question. And my book is really a series of case studies of these local outbreak investigations and how they built into something much broader. And in almost every single one of those case studies, there was some form of resistance of how an epidemiologist faced a local community and how that resistance went, Sometimes they were able to convince local authorities, sometimes not, and how that knowledge then filtered back to the lawmaking process in Parliament. And so I take typhoid fever as this disease which is really on the scale of the nation of England and Wales, a disease that just seems to be popping up. And you know, there no contemporary that I found made a map of all of England and Wales showing the typhoid outbreaks. But if one were to do that for the period of 1860 to 1870, you would just see it scattered all around without any discernible pattern from year to year. And as a result of that, I think the disparate nature of the epidemic profile, it needed this kind of local investigation and the feedback loops to fit in to both construct a kind of practice of epidemiology, but then also to move forward with preventive public health. Because, you know, typhoid, like many infectious diseases, and not unlike COVID-19 today, doesn't just have one simple pathway. The pathways of spreading infectious diseases are incredibly complicated from a biosocial perspective.
So you've got one more question in the chat right now from Juliet. Was there a fix made by Queen Victoria to the source, and especially for the general public, that caused her precious birdie to fall ill with typhoid?
Yeah, this is it's a really fascinating story, and I hope that if you're interested in this at all, anyone, you'll pick up a copy of my book. So in chapter 1, I talk about how, you know, after the prince is sick, there is this intense moment where doctors from all around the country are obsessed, and I use that word really pretty strongly, with trying to find the cause of why Birdie got sick. You know, because this was a disease that was so aligned with the filthy urban industrial poor. How could the future King of England get this disease? And so there was an investigation. The Lancet actually had their own sanitary investigation. The medical department started their own investigation. Several independent doctors did their own investigation, and they went to Scarborough. They investigated the house. They investigated the local area. And what the conclusion was by early 1872 was that staying in Scarborough House, in this mansion, that Birdie must have breathed in dangerous sewer gases. And that's interesting because sewer gas had long been a kind of fear from the earliest of, you know, domestic engineering and domestic plumbing, that breathing those noxious vapors could cause any number of infectious diseases, typhoid in particular. But the hunt for sewer gases became intensified in the period after 1871 as well. What I show in my book, and as one sort of final thought here, is that an interest in sewer gas, which we know today to be, you know, blatantly not an epidemiological pathway for spreading typhoid fever, but searching for sewer gas led epidemiologists to those sanitary systems. So it led them to sort of see the inside, the skeletal nature of houses and of what was underneath the ground of early water supply and sewerage systems. And so by looking for the wrong thing, they actually came towards, you know, in actually pretty short succession, in about a decade, the real pathways through food and water supplies. So sort of this classic story of the 19th century public health is of officials sometimes did the right thing for the wrong reason.
Here. I can't thank you enough for a wonderful talk. We are delighted that you were able to be here with us this evening. This talk was recorded. It will be posted on our website very soon. So it will be shared with others. And thank you to everyone for coming. And please watch for our other programs. Join us at other events. We would love to see you. Bye.